Welcome to TheKillFile, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown because, in TheKillFile, nothing stays buried forever. Hello there, and welcome to episode 95 of TheKillFile. I am so glad that you guys are back for another story. Before we jump into today's case, a few quick reminders. First, please take a second to rate, review, subscribe, or follow TheKillFile wherever you get your podcast fix. It helps support the podcast and also helps others to find us and follow along. The farther we spread, the quicker I will one day be able to give you guys more content each week. Next, if you haven't checked out the website at TheKillFile.com, you should give it a look. There, you can find more about how TheKillFile got started, and while you're there, you can suggest a case you want me to cover, you can submit a story for your own to be read on the bonus content, and you can find TheKillFile's merch shop. There, we have a ton of different KillFile gear, as well as some fun true crime stuff for yourself, or for that true crime lover in your life. The hidden files are the bonus content from TheKillFile that was forced to take a break, but will eventually be back up and running. For those of you who want a preview of what they will be like, you can head over to Patreon and find TheKillFile or the hidden files, and see if it's something you would like. They are similar to our Monday episodes, but they are slightly different, revolving around other dark-type stories like plane crashes, town bullies, and even natural disasters. Stay tuned for their re-debut date. Finally, don't forget to follow TheKillFile on whichever social media platforms you like. We are on Blue Sky, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. If you're interested in talking about true crime and more of my personal musings, you can follow me on Facebook, searching just my name and KillFile after it. Okay, that's it for business. Let's talk about today's case. Today, we are going to be talking about a story I've personally never heard of, but found so interesting. We are going to be discussing the murders committed by a man named Joseph Ball, aka the Butcher of Elmendorf. Trigger warnings for today are going to be murder. Let's jump in. Today's case is going to bring us back to the year of 1936 and to the big old state of Texas. As this case is an old-timey type case, there isn't as much information out there about it, so this may end up being slightly shorter than our others, but I will do my best. Texas, in 1936, was celebrating its 100th anniversary of its own independence by holding a huge event called the Texas Centennial Exposition, and this was held in Dallas's Fair Park. According to an AI overview, it was estimated that nearly 6 million people were in attendance of this event. People that had gathered in such astonishing numbers were witness to history in the making with not only some technology, but entertainment as well. According to sources, I guess the Centennial was trying to carry on this narrative of, Texas's empire and white supremacy, but in a countermeasure, there was something called, I'm sorry to say this word, and it makes me super uncomfortable and awkward, it's just the name of the exhibit, but I don't mean any offense at all, the Hall of Negro Life. Here, there are various exhibits of art that were called quote-unquote Afro-futurist by an artist named Aaron Douglas. And these would challenge the narrative that the Centennial was trying to push forward. Good for him. His art showed a stark difference to the journey of time the other exhibits at the fair may have shown. Something that I found interesting was the fact that many of the structures that were at the fair would eventually fade away or fall apart. However, the Hall of Negro Life was actually demolished just after the Centennial closed, which of course it was. How dare other human beings not be whitewashed, right? The Centennial was said to run from June 6, 1936 until November 29, 1936. Other significant events going on at this time would of course be the Great Depression, which was marked by horrific financial hardships felt all over the country. And I personally believe the effects of this were felt maybe even in my own generation, watching our grandparents or whoever save things or have what we may consider little oddities due to having to live without so much as they were growing up. I personally am still this way. I'm cheap and thrifty and love to save things that I know I might use in the future, so I don't have to spend money on it again. And I got that from no one but myself. So when I hear these stories of people doing this, I completely understand, and I think it's just good sense. Not like a hoarder by any means, but saving things that could be useful. Segregation was still in full swing at the time, as the Jim Crow laws were in their era, with people supposed to be feeling equal but separate for whatever dumbass reason. It's like, yeah, we're equals, but I don't want you to use my water fountain, okay? What the fuck? During this decade, there was a little nickname I didn't even know was used for anything other than when you say it about people, but it was called the Dirty 30s. Because of the Dust Bowl having devastating storms which caused farmers to lose their land and their poor families to struggle to even survive. It was said that they would resort to, which I think is smart, to hanging wet sheets outside of their windows in order to try to catch some of the dust from coming in. This brings us to a small town in the southeastern sphere of Texas called Elmendorf. Great fucking name. At the time, Elmendorf approximately had 300 residents, calling the town their home. Elmendorf was kind of known for its products of clay, marked by a company called Star Clay Products, and this was like the big employer of the area. The company was said to specialize in fire brick and contributed highly to the economics of the area at the time. Other local businesses in the area at this time was a bar called the Sociable Inn. The bar was owned by a man named Joseph Ball, and on one particular occasion in the summer of 1938, the Bexar County Sheriff's Office strolled through the bar's doors looking for Joe to ask a few questions. A former girlfriend of Joe's, a woman named Minnie Godart, known by the nickname Big Minnie, had gone missing about a year before now, and since then the family have inquired to the sheriff's office about looking for her. Back when Minnie had first gone missing, her family had gone to Joe asking him if he knew where she was. Joe told them that Minnie had in fact given birth to a black baby and then hurriedly left town. A year later, when the sheriff's office came looking for Minnie, questioning Joe, they didn't find any evidence of foul play. Therefore, they dismissed Joe as a suspect in her disappearance. In 1885, a man named Frank Ball had moved to the small town of Elmendorf, Texas, and after settling in it, he would open a factory that was said to process cotton. I would hate to think of what that looked like for the people that were quote-unquote employed there. Not long after Frank started his business, the railroad would be laid down through the town, which would help to make Frank rich with his cotton factory. Frank was married to a woman named Elizabeth, and not only was the couple able to open up a store in their newly founded town that one source said sold anything from shoes to even caskets, but they would also go on to have 8 children, many of whom were said to be either fairly important or at least almost all of them flourished in their lives. One of their children would become a local trustee after working for the school district for a long time, and another would go on to open his own grocery store and married a woman that was later pointed to as postmaster by President Franklin Roosevelt. The couple's second child would be a boy named Joseph D. Ball, who had been born on January 7th, 1896. Joe was said to be a kind of loner throughout his childhood, not really engaging in many of the things that other kids his age did. Joe would usually be found in the great outdoors, either exploring or instead fishing, but as he was growing up, his newer passion was, of course, guns. Sources said that he was basically obsessed with them and spent much of his free time shooting and practicing his shot. On a little documentary I found on YouTube by Song Lyrics, there was an interview with Joe's nephew, Richard Ball, nicknamed Bucky, who talked about his uncle. He would admit that his uncle was such a good shot that he could actually sit on the hood of his car and shoot a bird off a telephone wire. That's how good his aim was. On April 6, 1917, America would become part of World War I, when it would declare war against Germany. Not long after the start of the war, Joe would enlist in the military and was said to fight on the front lines over in Europe. After serving 2 years in the war, as it came to an end, Joe would receive an honorable discharge and move back home to Elmendorf. Joe would give working for his father a try, but according to many sources, this didn't last for very long. It was the belief of many that after serving in the war and what he may have gone through over there, Joe may have needed some time to adjust back into being a civilian. I think knowing what we know about mental health after people serve in wars, this could absolutely be true. This was right around the time of Prohibition, and Joe must have had some knowledge of running a business from his father or his family, because when Joe realized that there was a huge demand for illegal alcohol, he decided to become a bootlegger. I guess Joe would actually be kind of an alcohol delivery man, as he would drive around in his car, which was a Model A Ford. When I looked this up, it's like one of those old-timey buggy-looking cars. So Joe would take around a 50-gallon barrel of whiskey and he would sell it out of his car all around the area. At some point, Joe would hire a young black man named Clifton Wheeler to help him in the bootlegging business, but it was said that eventually Clifton, who was a handyman by trade, would find himself doing the majority of the work himself. One source said that Clifton was terrified of Joe because when Joe would get drunk, which I can only imagine was probably often, he would take out his gun and he would shoot at Clifton's feet, making him, quote, dance the jitterbug, according to an article in Crime Library written by David Lohr. After Prohibition had ended, Joe had a rougher time, as people would be able to get alcohol wherever they liked now. So Joe decided to go legit and open his saloon, since he already knew the alcohol business. Joe would go on to buy a little plot of land that was next to his town, where he built a little saloon. This would double as his living quarters as well. He would name his tavern Sociable Inn, and in the back of the bar were 2 bedrooms. And out front, he featured the bar, tables, and a piano. Sources said that sometimes men in the bar would also enjoy watching cockfights, which is sad to me, but I guess back then, what else was there to do? Clifton also helped and worked at the bar, and although the bar was said to be doing fairly well, Joe wanted some kind of shtick that would draw people to his bar specifically over other places. So he came up with a great idea. He was also going to feature at his bar live alligators, where people could come and watch him feed them and enjoy the scary reptiles safely. Joe would, towards the back of his bar, have a large hole dug out of the ground, and afterwards he cemented the hole and filled it with water. Also, how do you think they filled it with water? Just curious, because I bet it was a pain in the ass. After the quote-unquote habitat was set up for the gators, he put up a 10-foot fence to keep them from escaping and probably to try to keep people safe as well. Joe then put in the pen 5 alligators, said to be 1 large one and 4 smaller ones. Also, how did they do this too? Did he buy them? Did he go out and hunt them? I couldn't find anything about how he actually got them in. This idea was a hit for Joe Ball as people showed up by the dozens to look at the gators, and especially on Saturdays. I guess this was the day that he would show off his feeding of the reptiles, where sources said that he would take either chunks of meat or live cats, dogs, raccoons, or other small animals and throw them in the pit for the alligators to eat, and the crowd loved it. There were some awful accounts of how people showed up to get drunk and watch Joe throw whatever he had live into the pit, including kittens and puppies. Gross. Bucky would describe how people would show up with little animals and creatures to have Joe throw in, and regardless of what went in, the gators would find the animal and eat it. Bucky remembers Joe taking his hand and walking him around the quote-unquote pond, is what they called it, which was just the gator pit. Joe was said to have a darker side to him that was not only seen as creepy, but it was known that people did not want to cross Joe. Many of his patrons got along with him, but that was not the case for all. Besides the alligators, which attracted such a big crowd, it was also known that Joe hired the prettiest and youngest girls to waitress and bartend at the Sociable Inn. However, it was commented on numerous times that none of the pretty girls seemed to last all that long. I can only imagine what this job was like for a young pretty girl back in the 30s. Those poor things. Joe often told his customers part of the reasons that the girls weren't there as long is because he usually found the drifter type that would move on eventually. Joe was around 40 years old and was still said to be very attractive. He was muscular and the envy of many men in his town, as the young women who came and went from working at the bar seemingly lusted after their employer. I personally think he looks ugly as fuck, no offense, but maybe there weren't a lot of options in this small town back then. In 1934, Joe would meet Minnie Godart from Seguin, Texas. Her nickname was Big Minnie. I guess Joe's friends did not take kindly to Minnie. Most of them hated her, sources saying they thought her to be meddlesome and bossy. Joe didn't seem to mind any of these qualities in Minnie, and after the two were dating, they ran the bar together. The couple was said to be together for about 3 years before Joe, being the ladies' man he was, started to fall for one of the other waitresses that he had hired, a young girl named Dolores Goodwin, nicknamed Buddy. Although Joe wasn't known to be the best man around, as he allegedly had a gnarly temper, People close to both of them said that in one instance, Joe had thrown a glass bottle at her that had cut and left a scar all the way down from Dolores's eye to her neck. Jesus Christ. Regardless, Dolores also fell for Joe. Not only was Joe juggling Minnie and Dolores, but then he hired yet another young woman he would end up being involved with romantically, a 22-year-old young woman named Hazel Brown, nicknamed Shotzi. I just have to say that these nicknames are the best. Big Minnie, Buddy, and now Shotzi? Yes, what an old-timey feel to all of them. I love it. All three of the women worked with Joe at the bar as he was seemingly struggled to deal with his feelings for all three. That was until the summer of 1937. This is when Minnie would vanish. A few months after Minnie had disappeared, Joe and Dolores were married. According to sources, during the time that Dolores and Joe were married, Joe at some point confessed to his wife that Minnie had not just ran off. He said that instead, he had actually taken her to a local beach where the couple went to have some fun one day, when he then shot her in the head and buried her body in the sand. Dolores seemingly did not believe Joe, but regardless, she confided in her friend Hazel, who worked at the bar with the pair. Dolores, of course, didn't seem to know about Hazel and Joe's affair. Bucky, Joe's nephew, would describe hearing from his own father, so Joe's brother, that Joe had taken Minnie to the beach and they had a black chauffeur for the outing, swimming at a place called Port Aransas. Joe told his chauffeur to stay at the car while he and Minnie had gone down to the beach, and after a bit, Joe had allegedly told Minnie to stand up to see the sunset, and when she did, Joe shot her in the back of the head. Afterwards, he asked his chauffeur to help him dig a hole, and as they did, the water washed up onto the beach, making the body sink pretty far down. Bucky recalled that eventually, when the news came out about the murders, that the authorities had to use machines to dig up the body, and they would find it some 15 feet underneath the sand. While Hazel was still employed at the bar, and Joe and Dolores were married, Dolores was allegedly in a terrible car accident that would leave her severely injured. She apparently had lost her left arm, and the rumor mills started pumping out gossip of how Dolores had actually lost her arm to one of the alligators of Joe's. This, of course, was deemed untrue. In fact, Bucky would say that Dolores had been driving back from San Antonio and was going to use her hand to signal. And as she did, a truck carrying a wide load of cedar posts drove past Dolores. And when they passed, it hit her arm and tore it off. Oh my God! Do you know how many times I put my arm out the window while I'm driving? We all do, probably, and every so often I snatch it back in because I feel like I'm too close to something as I'm driving, and I always wonder what would happen if my arm or my hand accidentally hit a sign or something. Holy shit, can you imagine looking down and seeing that some of your arm had been ripped off right then and there? That poor woman, what a horrific thing to have happen to you. In April of 1938, Dolores vanished. Hazel and Joe were now something of an item, but it didn't seem like this lasted long. Bucky said that his uncle and Hazel married, but I couldn't confirm this in any other sources, so I'm unsure. But according to the documentary, Hazel had come into contact with a young suitor who wanted to whisk her away for a new and better life, and Hazel was in love with this new man. Allegedly, when Joe found out about the new relationship, being the jealous man that he refused to, quote-unquote, allow Hazel to leave with her new suitor. Real quick, ladies, we need to stop letting men say to us, I can't allow you to do this or that, even if it's something nice. I recently was watching this stupid fucking YouTuber my son watches, and he was commenting on another video because I guess that's where we're headed for entertainment. And this young man was sitting there saying, if you allow your woman to dress like this or that, she a hoe or a whore or looking for it or whatever. I was fuming, telling my son that no motherfucker on this planet owns his fucking girlfriend, wife, boyfriend, or any other person in a relationship. Men don't get to fucking allow us to do anything. My life, my body, my fucking choice. And that goes for all of us. So If you can't handle that lack of control with your fucking man ego, you can go fuck yourself. But that also goes for women as well, because I know that there are women out there who need to hear that. People are not fucking property. Ugh, rant over. Sorry. Anyways, Joe tells Hazel he won't allow her to leave, so she in turn threatens to tell the police about what she knows happened to Minnie. Hazel then vanished. According to Joe's employee Clifton, after Hazel threatened him, Joe shot and killed Hazel. Why? He then allegedly confessed that Joe and Clifton, together, dismembered Hazel's body and then proceeded to bury her near the San Antonio River. It was said that even though Joe's girlfriends and or employees seemed to be up and leaving him for one reason or another, his business was still flourishing and allegedly, on the outside, seemed to be operating well. Joe used his pet alligators to draw in crowds each weekend and was seemingly very protective and proud of them. On one particular occasion, a neighbor of Joe's had complained to him about the smell of rotting meat that was coming from the gator pit, which I can only imagine if he was throwing in like live animals almost every weekend. Can you imagine what that place would smell like? Anyways, when the neighbor complained, Joe was so protective over his animals, he allegedly pulled out a gun and rudely told his neighbor the smell must be his alligator's food, and then told his quote-unquote nosy neighbor to mind his own damn business unless he wanted to be the food himself. After this, the neighbor reportedly had moved to another city. When Minnie's family showed up asking questions and reporting her missing to the sheriff's office, they paid a visit to Joe to ask him some questions about his ex-girlfriend on a few different occasions. However, since they never had any evidence of anything actually happening to Minnie, nor did they have evidence that if something had, that Joe had had anything to do with it, he was dismissed as a suspect. Another young waitress who had been working part-time at the Sociable Inn was Julia Turner. She was a 23-year-old young woman, and after she too had gone missing, the local sheriff's office paid a visit to Joe, asking him some questions. Well, it turns out that one of the sheriffs in the county, John Clevenhagen, was good friends with Joe. In fact, they would often hang out and go hunting together. I don't want to speculate on this man's thoughts or feelings, but I can only imagine how things could play out if someone you feel like you may know very well needs to be questioned about some things. Maybe it's hard to think of someone that you're friends with actually doing anything scary like that, but who knows. Another person who worked at the sheriff's office but was a deputy was also friends with Joe, and this man's name was Deputy John R. Gray. When the authorities came asking about Julia, Joe informed them that he knew that she had been having some personal issues and had to move on from the area. They didn't have anything else to go on, so they left the bar, and they decided to search Julia's home that she had shared with a roommate. When the authorities searched her home, they would find that if she had left without any of her clothes or other belongings that she would need. When the authorities realized this, they headed back to Joe's bar to talk to him some more. Joe then told the sheriffs that he remembered she seemed quote-unquote desperate, so Joe had given her $500 because Julia was having some issues with her roommate and didn't want to return to the house. Over the course of the next few months, another 2 employees of the Sociable Inn would vanish. Unfortunately, there's no record of who these women were or even their ages, which is sad. They don't deserve to be forgotten. I'm sure someone, somewhere, knows their story, or their parents told them the story of their disappearance, right? Joe was questioned for hours and hours about their absence, but again, Joe said it had nothing to do with him. Both of them just left town on their own accord. Because the authorities didn't have any evidence to the contrary, they couldn't hold him. However, there was starting to become a long list of young women who had gone missing that all had one thing in common. They worked at the Sociable Inn. Everything would change on September 23, 1938, when the evidence the authorities were looking for would come forward. One man, sources say, told the sheriff's office that he himself had actually witnessed Joe cutting some meat off a human body, feeding those pieces of meat to his alligators. Oh my God! What did he see? Why are records from so long ago not kept better? I want to know so much more. I searched for records, but I couldn't find shit. Another witness came forward around this same time that the authorities were trying to figure out how to proceed with the information that they had just been given, and the new witness told them about a barrel. The witness would say to Deputy John Gray that behind Joe's sister's barn, there had been a, quote, foul-smelling barrel, stating to him that it smelled like something inside of it was dead. The very next morning, Deputy Gray and Sheriff John Clevenhagen went to Joe's sister's property and barn, but the barrel was gone. Regardless, they decided to talk to their mutual friend, Joe. When both Deputy Gray and Sheriff Clevenhagen went to the sociable inn, according to Bucky, they told their buddy that they hated to do this, but they had orders to bring him in, and apparently they had evidence against him. This is when, seemingly, Joe knew that the gig was up. He told the sheriff and the deputy that he needed to close down the bar and take the money from the register with him. They all headed inside, and Joe went to the register that was apparently up against a wall, while Gray and Clevenhagen were behind Joe, waiting for him to do whatever it is he needed to do. Joe then proceeded to grab his pistol out of the register, spun around, and shot himself in the chest, killing himself. What the sheriff and deputy didn't know, besides the fact that Joe kept his .45 pistol in the register, was that the reason he spun around was because Joe knew that if he shot himself in the chest, the bullet would penetrate through his chest and would most likely hit one of his buddies after it had killed him. Seemingly not wanting to hurt either of them, he quickly spun around before he shot himself, and Joe was right. The bullet went through his heart and it struck the wall. Sheriff Clevenhagen would later say Joe knew exactly what would happen if he had shot himself with his back to his friends. It would have also killed one of them, which is why he did what he did. The sheriff also said that it happened so quickly that he didn't even have a chance to pull out his own revolver or do anything about the situation. After Joe shot and killed himself, it sort of left things hanging and questions unanswered because they never got a chance to ask Joe about the various missing women. It was later found out that Dolores wasn't murdered. In fact, she had moved to San Diego and started a new life with her sister, just being estranged from her husband. According to sources, one other woman who had vanished was also allegedly found later in Phoenix, Arizona. However, after some investigation, it would be figured out why Joe most likely shot himself. After the bar premises and alligator pond was searched, authorities found some rotting meat, which was to be expected, but they were also said to have found an axe that had blood and hair on it. This is what led the authorities to believe that Joe had been killing and mutilating victims and then feeding their remains to his alligators. Now, Bucky, his nephew, would say during his interview that there were many rumors about this having happened, but he didn't know for sure if that was the truth or not. He would also say that as time went on, the stories about his uncle seemed to evolve and more was added on. In fact, he would say that people from all over would ask him about his uncle when they found out that his last name was Ball. During one particular instance, Bucky was stationed at Corpus Christi, and a friend of his mother had sent his friend a package, and inside was a comic book. They knew that his last name was Ball, and when his friend said, "You probably don't know who this guy was or whatever," but showed him the comic, it was about Joe Ball, the story of Bucky's uncle. There are stories, movies, and other things based off Joe Ball's story and based off the questions of whether or not Joe fed his victims to alligators. I mean, a witness had come forward about seeing it for himself before all of this came out, so who knows? But I will tell you what we do know. Clifton Wheeler was brought in for questions where at first he denied knowing anything about any of the women who had gone missing until finally, as questioning continued, he started to come out with what he knew and what had happened to at least some of the women. This is when Clifton would tell the authorities about the murder of Hazel, and to prove that he was telling the truth of what actually happened to the authorities, he brought them to where they had buried Hazel. The next day, Clifton brought the authorities near the San Antonio River where Joe and himself had buried the poor girl, and as Clifton started digging up what was said to be loose dirt, a horrific smell started to emanate, and traces of what looked to be blood began to be seen. Sources would say the smell was so bad that many of the members of the authorities were unable to stomach it, and they began to vomit. Finally, after the digging process, Clifton pulled out from the ground 2 legs, 2 arms, and a human torso. I love how the authorities are just having this man who was an accessory after the fact dig up the remains of this poor woman himself and pull everything out by hand. Like, that would never happen nowadays, and it just adds to the old-timey feeling of it all. I guess it was the 30s. So after pulling up the body parts that he had, the authorities asked where Hazel's head was. This is when Clifton pointed to a leftover campfire that was nearby. In the remains of this campfire, they were able to find pieces of skull, a jawbone, and some teeth that were all said to be the remains of Hazel Brown. After this, Clifton told them about the night this happened. He would state that after a night of heavy drinking, Joe had asked Clifton to grab some alcohol and also some blankets. Joe then took Clifton in his car to his sister's property behind the barn, where there was a large 55-gallon barrel, and the two loaded it up and took it to the river. Clifton alleged that Joe took out a gun and made him dig a grave at gunpoint. Then the pair opened the barrel together. Inside was the body of Hazel Brown. At first, Clifton alleged he flat out refused to help Joe dismember Hazel's rotting body, at which point Joe started to do the job himself. However, Clifton reportedly told the authorities that because Joe was so drunk, he couldn't exactly saw off Hazel's limbs, to which he made Clifton hold down her body to help him. Clifton said the two would at different times start to get sick to their stomachs from the smell, so they would stop and take a break and drink some of the alcohol that Joe made Clifton bring with him. After they had finished the job of the dismemberment, Clifton said they buried Hazel's remains and then proceeded to throw her head into the campfire. I am just so very curious why Joe decided to dismember the body at all. Why couldn't they have just buried the poor woman in a grave they dug? It makes no sense to me that she needed to be taken apart, unless Joe enjoyed that, which would make more sense, or if he was just still very angry at Hazel for wanting to leave him. Or I guess he could have just been wasted and not thinking properly, but still, it's weird. And putting her head in the campfire? Again, why? This just screams anger to me, which means not only was he a murderer, but he definitely had a dark side to him that maybe many didn't get to see. After the confession as to his own involvement of covering up the murder of Hazel, the authorities asked Clifton about Minnie's disappearance. This is when Clifton would say that Joe had taken Minnie to the beach to swim and have a day together. Then Clifton said Joe distracted her and shot her. Apparently, Joe told Clifton that he had killed Minnie because she was pregnant, and he didn't want the pregnancy to interfere with his new relationship with Dolores. Yeah, what a fucking piece of shit. Are you kidding me? I was so curious why he had killed Minnie in the first place during the case, but I guess we know now. So instead of stepping up like men were supposed to back in the day, and helping to take care of Minnie and his child, he fucking killed them both so he could be with his new fling? Fucking shitbag. Clifton was said to be quote-unquote the black chauffeur that Bucky was referring to in his interview. After Joe killed Minnie, Clifton helped him bury her in the sand, and then the pair went back to the bar like nothing fucking happened. When the authorities found the area where Minnie had been killed, they used machinery to uncover the remains in the sand, and they were able to find Minnie's decomposing body deep in the sand. Most likely because the waves of the ocean moved the sand around so much, burying her deeper and deeper. Her remains were uncovered on October 14th, 1938. While authorities continued to question Clifton about the various other women who had disappeared after having worked at the sociable inn, he denied knowing anything further about any of the other murders. The rotting meat that had been found in the alligator pit was figured out to be that of animals. However, there was heavy speculation that the original investigators at the scene had actually cleaned up any remaining bones or flesh that they had found. Clifton Wheeler would receive a sentence of 2 years in prison for his role in the murders or the aftermath, and when he was released, he was said to have bought his own bar in the area. However, I guess it was hard for him to stay in town because of what happened, and eventually he would move away, but his family, I guess, remained. Joe's alligators were said to have been given to the San Antonio Zoo, where they had an alligator exhibit, according to Bucky, and he would finish his story by saying, of course, they don't really know every bit of what happened at his uncle's bar or in his life, but he hopes that it was just the things that they knew about and nothing more. Although it was never proven that Joe did, in fact, feed victims to his alligators, there were rumored to be other people who did, in fact, see proof of this that came out after Joe died. There was a story about a man who had caught Joe throwing the body of a woman into the pit at one point, and Joe threatened to kill the man and his family if he didn't leave town. The man took his family and actually fled to California, and they did not return to their hometown until Joe Ball was dead. One of Joe's sisters was said to have sued the magazine True Detective several times over what she said were false stories about her brother due to the salacious nature of his proven murders and his alleged ones. Joe had been married to another woman after Minnie, who I guess had found out about what happened to his other girlfriends before and after Dolores and took off, being afraid that the same would happen to her. After Joe's suicide, she came forward stating that she had personally known about quote-unquote 4 or so murders. The swirl of what were rumors and what was fact seems to be so muddied since the murders in the late 30s that it's hard to actually know what happened in the tiny town of Elmendorf and how many murders there actually were. Depending on sources you look at, some say 5 and some say 12. Some of the women have since been found and some were never found. One thing we know for sure was that Joe Ball had a side to him that was much scarier than the pit of alligators behind his bar. And that, my friends, is the story of the Butcher of Elmendorf, aka Joseph D. Ball, the Alligator Man. So there's a movie about this story that I haven't seen. Maybe some of you have. It's called Eaten Alive. If you've seen it, tell me if it's worth watching. I can't help but wonder how much of this case has gotten lost in the decades and how much has been created since it all happened because it was so long ago. It's hard to know. Even if the authorities were able to tell the rotting flesh around the alligator pit was animal at the time, how can they know for sure that maybe some small fragments of bones that they may have found weren't human? Why would there be so many witnesses who came out saying that they had seen Joe feeding human remains to his gators if it weren't true? But also, if that were the case, then why didn't he just do that with Minnie and Hazel? I guess Minnie was buried where she was killed, though, and if that was truly his first murder, then maybe he hadn't thought of the gators being used yet, or maybe he never really did. But one thing I will say, whether he actually used them to dispose of his victims or not, there are a few odd things about the case. Why did Joe dismember Hazel if that's not something that he had already done or had wanted to do? There was truly no reason for that, nor putting her head in the fire. Also, why did he kill himself if Clifton hadn't confessed to anything yet, and all they had were some evidence that was linked to the last young woman who had gone missing, Julia? I mean, there has to be more than the 2 murders for him to kill himself over it, right? Because he was cleared in both of those cases. I also saw in some sources that allegedly Clifton claimed there were more murders as well that he knew about, but he did not take part in. As much as I'm like a rational, logical person and have a hard time believing in rumors and think that he may not have fed women to his alligators, there's definitely no denying that there is more to this story than the shrunken down version that others are trying to claim as truth. Even during the interview with Bucky, he said something like he would rather a person cuss him out personally than to talk bad about his uncle or his quote-unquote tiny town that he loved. And with that mentality alone, it's hard not to think that people are trying to keep the nonsense out and be left alone regardless of what they may actually know. Which, I mean, is understandable. I can't imagine how annoying it would be to live in such a small place, especially back then. And when every single person finds out your name, they want to talk about this one thing, this one person, this one story. That's annoying as fuck, and I know what I'm talking about because of my name. After 11 years of hearing Britney Spears jokes, there are days where I'm just fucking over it, and I don't want to stop to hear your stupid joke as I'm trying to get shit done. You know? Well, I hope you guys enjoyed learning about this case as much as I did, and remember, drinking at a bar that has an alligator pit out back in a rinky-dink town that probably protects its own is maybe not the best idea. Come on back next Monday when we will cover another case here on the Kill File where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.